Have you ever considered that the history you learned in primary school might just be like a highly successful, centuries-old PR campaign?
Oh, I mean, it's a fascinating way to look at it. It really forces us to completely reevaluate that neat, binary view of history we're so often handed.
Right. Seriously, when you think about the founding of America, you probably picture, the Mayflower, buckle-hatted pilgrims, and just a pristine, perfectly harmonious Thanksgiving.
Yeah, the classic holiday card version.
Exactly. But what if the real story involves, like, ruthless secret investors, mutiny prevention, a desperate roommate agreement drawn up in a freezing harbor, and a frantic modern-day search for a skeleton?
It's quite the list.
Yeah.
But when you actually dig into the primary sources, like the original journals of the people who were there and the recent archaeological evidence, a much more complex picture emerges.
Yeah.
We start to see the actual mechanics of why these people crossed an ocean, and honestly, more importantly, how they managed to survive when just about everything went wrong.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, our deep dive is into the source material from Nicholas Hagger's book, The Secret Founding of America. And our mission here is to look past that mythology.
Right.
We are going to unpack the gritty, desperate, and sometimes incredibly secret realities of the first English planters in America. And I just love this approach because historical facts are, well, they're so often just the narrative that happened to survive.
That is so true. History is invariably written by the survivors. And to truly understand how those narratives get shaped, before we even get to the famous Mayflower in 1620, we really have to rewind 13 years.
To Jamestown.
Yes, to Jamestown in 1607, because the history books effectively crown the wrong hero right out of the gate.
Oh, man, everyone knows Captain John Smith. I mean, he gets all the glory, the statues, the Disney movie.
He really does.
But the author argues the true prime mover of Jamestown, the guy who actually organized the voyage, secured the funding, recruited the crew, was a man named Bartholomew Gosnold.
Yeah, Gosnold is a fascinating figure who has been almost entirely eclipsed. I mean, he had actually explored the American coast years earlier. He named Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard.
Wait, really? He named them?
He did. And he was the one who did the heavy lifting to get the Virginia Company charter off the ground. But there is a very practical reason you don't hear about him.
Which is?
He died in August 1607, just months after the settlers arrived in Jamestown. He just didn't survive that brutal first summer.
It's like exactly like a modern corporate group project, you know?
Oh, so?
Well, Gosnold did all the organizing, all the planning, all the logistics. Then he tragically dies, and John Smith takes over the marketing department and gives himself all the credit.
That is a very accurate analogy. Smith is left to write the journals and send the letters back to England, basically portraying himself as the sole savior of the colony while completely minimizing Gosnold's role.
But wait, if Gosnold died months into the expedition and Smith buried his legacy, how do we even know any of this is true today? Are we just, like, guessing based on a few missing journal entries?
Not at all. We actually know this because of a massive archaeological breakthrough in 1994.
Oh, right, the fort.
Exactly. For centuries, people assumed the original Jamestown fort was just a myth, or that it had long since eroded into the James River. But an archaeologist named Dr. William Kelso actually found the original footprint of the fort.
Which is incredible on its own.
It is. He uncovered hundreds of thousands of artifacts. And once he proved the fort existed, he set out to find Gosnold's body to prove his status as the true founding leader.
I read this part of the source material, and the way they figured out where to dig is straight out of a true crime show.
Oh, the deductive reasoning is brilliant. The historical record showed the Jamestown fort was a palisaded triangle. Kelso's team measured it out 140 yards on each side, with cannons at each of the three corners.
Right.
So the author hypothesized that because Gosnold was the colony's leader, he would have been given a grand military funeral. The protocol for that would be firing all the ordnance.
So all the cannons.
Yes. For a dead leader to be honored equally by all three cannons, where would he have to be placed?
He would have to be buried in the exact center of the fort. I mean, practically speaking, if you have hostile forces outside the walls, you aren't going to stand outside the palisade with your eyes closed in prayer.
Exactly. You bury your leader in the center, safe from outside arrows.
And Kelso used this theory, calculated the center based on the corners he found, and they actually found a remarkably well-preserved skeleton of a man in his 30s buried with a leader's staff.
What's fascinating here is that finding the skeleton is really only the first step. The scientific verification process to prove it is actually Gosnold is incredibly rigorous.
They did DNA testing, right?
They initially tried a DNA test, yeah. They exhumed a female relative from an English church floor in Shelley, but the sample was just too degraded to yield a match.
Oh, that's frustrating.
It was, but they also did visual tests, comparing the skull's structure to portraits of Gosnold's relatives who shared a very distinct, prominent hooked nose. And it matched the skull perfectly.
But they are taking it a step further now, right? With tooth enamel.
Yes, they are attempting to test the chemical signature of the skeleton's teeth. The mechanism here is fascinating. When you're a child, the minerals from the groundwater you drink, specifically isotopes of elements like strontium, they lock into your tooth enamel as it forms.
Wow.
And that enamel doesn't regenerate. It acts as a permanent chemical time capsule. So they want to prove this man grew up drinking the specific groundwater of Suffolk, England, which would definitively identify him as Bartholomew Gosnold.
We are chemically analyzing 400-year-old tooth enamel to correct a PR theft by John Smith. That is wild.
It really is.
So Jamestown survives because John Smith spins a good PR tale over Gosnold's grave. But a decade later, the next group to attempt this crossing didn't need PR to hide commercial failures. They needed it to hide their deep psychological terror of the world around them.
Yes, the Pilgrims.
Let's look at them, because they weren't looking for gold.
No, their motivation was entirely different. The separatists, who we now call the Pilgrims, left England because of a legal mechanism called the Act of Supremacy.
Okay.
King James I used this act to make himself the supreme head of the Church of England. That meant disagreeing with the church wasn't just a matter of bad theology. It was legally considered treason.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the king was forcing all nonconformists to comply. If you didn't, you were persecuted, imprisoned, and in the case of some early separatist leaders, actually hanged. So they fled to the Netherlands, expecting a holy refuge.
Hold on. They leave England because they're brutally persecuted. They get to the Netherlands, specifically Amsterdam, where there is total religious freedom and tolerance, and they hate it.
Yes, they really did.
Are you saying they were actually more terrified of tolerance than they were of the king's persecution?
That is exactly the dynamic at play. You have to understand what they walked into. They wanted a holy, purified city. Instead, they arrived in Amsterdam during a massive economic boom. It was a bustling global port with 100,000 people. There was rampant prostitution and something like 500 alehouses right around the docks. To their strict puritanical sensibilities, it resembled the corrupt Jerusalem condemned by the biblical prophets.
It feels like those modern off-the-grid communes. You pack up your whole family and move to a new city to escape pop culture, only to realize your kids are still listening to the radio and getting, as the source material literally calls it, Amsterdamnified.
Amsterdamnified, exactly. You cannot escape cultural osmosis just by changing zip codes. So after just over a year, they fled again, moving to Leiden, which was a center for the cloth trade.
And they stayed there for a while, right?
They stayed there from 1609 to 1620. But even in Leiden, they encountered a new terror, something called Arminianism.
What exactly is Arminianism, and why was it so terrifying to them?
It was a theological belief prevalent among the Dutch, arguing that all humans could potentially be saved through faith.
Which sounds nice.
You'd think so, but the separatists were strict Calvinists. They believed in predestination, that God had already chosen a specific elect for salvation, and everyone else was damned.
Oh, I see.
The idea that salvation was open to anyone threatened their core identity as God's chosen few. If their children grew up marrying into Dutch families who believed in free will, their pure covenant with God would be diluted.
They literally saw themselves as the new Hebrews fleeing Egypt. When the Netherlands proved too worldly, too tolerant, and too spiritually polluting, the terrifying, untamed wilderness of America became their only option.
Exactly.
But getting to that wilderness requires capital. And this is where the pristine myth of the Mayflower really falls apart for me. They had to make a disastrous business deal.
They did. To fund the voyage, they partnered with an English merchant named Thomas Weston and a syndicate called the London Adventurers.
Sounds sketchy.
Well, Weston was not a religious man. He was an investor looking for a return. And he forced a ruthless contract on the separatists.
Break down the mechanism of this contract for us. How bad was it?
It was essentially a form of collective indentured servitude. Weston insisted that all the accumulated wealth of the colony, not just the furs and timber they exported, but the settlers' own homes, their improved land, and their personal gardens, would belong to the joint stock company.
So they owned nothing.
Right. After 7 years, everything would be divided as profit between the investors in London and the colonists. The Pilgrims felt this stripped them of their independence and questioned their integrity, but they were so desperate to leave Leiden, they signed it.
And their luck only gets worse. They initially bought a second ship, the Speedwell, to make the crossing alongside the Mayflower. But the Speedwell was an absolute
A
disaster.
total disaster.
It leaked constantly. They had to sell off their own provisions, including like scores of casks of butter just to pay for repairs in port. Finally, they had to abandon the Speedwell entirely and cram everyone onto the Mayflower.
Yeah, that was a huge setback.
And here's a catch that blew my mind. Of the 102 passengers on that famous boat, only about 40 were actually saints, which is what the Pilgrims called themselves.
Right. The majority were what the saints called strangers. Because the investors in London wanted a return on their money, they weren't going to trust a bunch of religious ideologues to build a profitable colony by themselves.
Makes sense from a business standpoint.
Exactly. The investors recruited entrepreneurially minded non-separatists, tradesmen, soldiers like Miles Standish, and skilled workers to ensure the colony could actually function. So you have a situation where religious zealots are crammed into a leaking, overcrowded ship alongside pragmatic secular workers.
The tension must have been unbelievable, and the journey itself was brutal. At one point, during a massive storm, the main beam of the ship literally cracked.
That's right.
They only survived because someone happened to bring a giant mechanical iron screw from Holland, and they used it to jack the beam back into place. And then they finally spot land, but it's Cape Cod. They were supposed to land at the Hudson River.
Which was a huge problem, because landing outside their designated territory created a massive legal crisis. Their patent from the Virginia Company was only valid for the Hudson River area. Because they were anchoring in New England, which was outside that jurisdiction, the strangers realized the legal loophole. They essentially said, our contract is void. The moment we step off this ship, we are free agents. We aren't working for you or the investors.
They were facing a full-blown mutiny before they even stepped onto the beach. If they split up into factions in the wilderness, they would all die.
To prevent this, 41 male passengers sat down and drafted the Mayflower Compact. It was an agreement to stick together, to create a civil body politic, and to enact laws for the general good of the colony.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. We are taught to view the Mayflower Compact as this grand philosophical blueprint for American democracy. Like, it was written by men gazing nobly into the future.
Right, the idealized version.
But looking at the sources, it wasn't born out of high-minded democratic ideals at all. It was essentially a desperate roommate agreement drawn up in a freezing harbor to keep everyone from abandoning the project or killing each other.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the motivation was absolutely pragmatic survival. But we shouldn't dismiss its historical weight entirely.
Fair point.
The specific phrasing they agreed upon to be bound by just and equal laws was revolutionary. They weren't waiting for a king to hand down laws. They were agreeing to create them collectively through mutual consent.
That is pretty radical for the time.
It was. That conceptual framework, born out of a desperate attempt to stop a mutiny, set a massive precedent that echoed 170 years later in the United States Constitution.
It's amazing how desperation breeds innovation. But preventing a mutiny on the ship was nothing compared to the harsh reality of stepping onto land. Nature and human despair just took a massive toll at New Plymouth. I was reading the primary source excerpts from William Bradford's journal, and he wrote about that first winter. It pleased God to visit us then with death daily.
The mortality rate was staggering. They were hit by a combination of severe exposure, malnutrition, and scurvy.
Scurvy sounds terrible.
Oh, it's horrific. It breaks down the connective tissue in your body due to a lack of vitamin C. Half of the 102 settlers died in January and February alone. Bradford noted that at times there were only 6 or 7 sound persons left to fetch wood, make fires, wash the loathsome clothes, and care for the dying.
I can't stop fixating on one specific tragic detail from that first winter, which is the death of William Bradford's wife, Dorothy.
Yes.
The historical record simply states she fell over the side of the Mayflower and drowned while it was anchored in the harbor. But the waters were completely calm that day. I want you to imagine the sheer psychological terror of her final moments.
That's heartbreaking to think about.
You are staring out at a dark, frozen wilderness. Half your friends are dead or dying. You are starving. Was it a tragic slip on an icy deck, or was it a sign of absolute despair? Did she just, let go?
The source material explicitly raises that possibility. Given the context, the psychological toll must have been unimaginable. They were at the very edge of human endurance.
Yeah.
In that environment of daily death and constant fear, The strict moral codes and the absolute belief in divine providence were practically the only psychological armor holding the remaining 50 people together.
Their survival was also massively dependent on the Native Americans. I mean, Samoset casually walks into their camp one day and greets them in broken English. Much welcome, Englishmen, which must have absolutely blown their minds.
Yeah, sure it did.
And then Squanto, who had tragically been kidnapped and sold into slavery in Spain years prior, returned to his homeland and taught them the vital mechanism of planting corn using fish as fertilizer.
That agricultural knowledge was the only reason they didn't starve the second winter. But despite this reliance on outsiders, the Pilgrims maintained an incredibly rigid worldview.
Right.
In 1627, a Dutch merchant named Isaac de Rozier visited Plymouth. He wrote back to Europe noting they had built a secure town with a cannon-topped fort, but he was deeply shocked by their intense legalism.
Really? A Dutch merchant was shocked?
Yes. They strictly applied their anti-fornication and adultery laws not just to their own people, but they attempted to enforce them even on the Native Americans.
Even a Dutch merchant from the 1600s thought they were too intense. But Plymouth barely survived through sheer willpower. Meanwhile, a decade later, a second wave of settlers arrives that completely shifts the balance of power in New England.
The Puritans.
Right. These are the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Company, arriving between 1628 and 1630. They had a vastly different mindset, way better funding, and a massive fleet. Now, I want to explicitly state here for the listener, we are just impartially reporting the historical facts of this theocratic setup and the political actions of the Puritans. We are not endorsing or condemning their specific theological viewpoints.
Absolutely. We're just looking at how they operated. And unlike the separatist Pilgrims of Plymouth, who wanted to completely break away from the corrupt Church of England, the Puritans wanted to stay in the church but purify it from within. And in their new colony in Massachusetts, they wanted to merge church and state entirely. They envisioned a godly commonwealth where biblical law was the ultimate civil law.
Okay, looking strictly at the mechanics of their governance, setting aside the theology for a moment, how did they actually enforce this on a daily basis? Who had the power?
Power was restricted entirely to the elect. Under their system, you could only vote or hold office if you were a freeman.
And how did you become a freeman?
Well, you didn't just have to own property. You had to stand before the congregation and make a public, verifiable declaration of your personal experience of divine grace. Only those approved as full church members were granted the franchise.
John Winthrop, the governor, laid out this entire vision while they were still on the ship, the Arbella. He preached a famous sermon called A Model of Christian Charity, where he coined the concept of the city upon a hill.
Right, a very famous phrase.
He told them, "The eyes of all people are upon us." They believed they were divinely ordained to be a flawless beacon of godly living for the whole world to see.
But building a flawless beacon requires absolute conformity. And this is where we see the mechanism of their extreme intolerance. Because church and state were one, a theological disagreement was viewed as a civil rebellion.
Right, there's no separation.
But there was pushback. A man named Thomas Dudley actually read the company charter and realized it allowed all free men to make the laws, not just Winthrop and his inner circle of magistrates.
Oh, through him.
Yeah. Dudley forced Winthrop to accept a representative assembly, which was a massive step toward a democratic framework.
But if you pushed back on religion instead of administration, the punishment was incredibly brutal. Take Anne Hutchinson. I want to look at exactly why she was such a threat. She didn't just disagree with a sermon. She claimed to receive direct personal revelation from God.
Exactly. The mechanism of her defiance threatened the entire structural power of the colony. If God speaks directly to Anne Hutchinson in her living room, why do the people need the magistrates or the established ministers to interpret the law?
It totally bypasses them.
It dismantled their authority completely. She was put on trial, banished into the wilderness, and when she was later killed in a Native American raid, Winthrop publicly proclaimed it was the righteous judgment of God.
And she wasn't the only one. Mary Dyer, a Quaker, was banished, kept returning to protest their laws, and was eventually hanged on Boston Common. Roger Williams was banished simply for suggesting that civil magistrates shouldn't have the power to punish people for their religious beliefs.
Yeah, he had to flee.
He barely escaped arrest and fled through the snow to found Rhode Island as a sanctuary for religious freedom. So what does this all mean? I look at the Puritans, and it's a tragic irony.
What do you mean?
They are like a plucky startup that fled a massive oppressive monopoly in England to create a free space. But the instant they secure their own territory, they build a ruthless monopoly of their own, where the HR department literally hangs you for disagreeing with company policy.
It's a perfect analogy, and it highlights a crucial historical mechanism. This raises an important question. How do they get away with this level of autonomy?
Yeah, where were the regulators?
It comes down to a piece of paper, the company charter. Normally, a joint stock company charter physically remained in London, so the king's regulators could attend board meetings and monitor the colony. But Winthrop secretly brought the physical charter with him on the ship to America.
Oh, wow.
By moving the paper across the ocean, the king's men couldn't attend the meetings. Winthrop effectively created a massive legal loophole for self-governance.
So they birthed home rule through a clerical sleight of hand. That is incredible.
Exactly. This is their dual legacy. On one hand, by moving that charter, they established a representative court and birthed the American democratic tradition. On the other hand, they used that very democracy to entrench a moral rigidity, a deep fear of outsiders, and a theocratic instinct to merge church and state.
Which brings us back to where we started. The founding of America was not a pristine, unified event with everyone holding hands around a turkey. It was a chaotic, messy collision.
It really was.
You have forgotten founders like Bartholomew Gosnold dying in a triangular fort while his PR guy steals the credit. You have desperate ideological refugees terrified that Dutch alehouses are ruining their kids. You have pragmatic tradesmen held together by a legal band-aid drawn up on a freezing boat. And you have wealthy Puritans building a representative democracy wrapped inside a lethal theocracy.
The contrast between the saints, the religious ideologues who view the world in absolutes, and the strangers, the secular pragmatists just trying to survive and make a profit on that very first boat is essential.
Absolutely.
Understanding that deep foundational divide is the key to understanding the cultural DNA of the country. It was never just one group with one unified vision.
Exactly. So why should you care about these distinctions today? Because understanding the gritty reality changes how we view everything that came after, which leaves you with a final thought to mull over. If the very survival of the Mayflower colony required the strict, ideological saints to compromise and share power with the practical, non-religious strangers, is it possible that the defining characteristic of American success isn't actually shared beliefs? Maybe it's the uncomfortable, forced compromises between people who actually completely disagree with each other. It makes you wonder. If that initial PR campaign hadn't been so successful at hiding the mutinies and the desperation, would we be better at handling our disagreements today?